All right, let us go over to the Sixth Man of the Year award. Let's talk about that for Sixth Man of the Year. Geoff, do you wanna share our Sixth Man of the Year award?
Sure. So we have Bogdan Bogdanovic winning.
So that was one thing I was like, surely they're not talking about Boyan. I figured it was Bogdan. I was like, this could get weird.
Yeah,
that's very weird. This is Hot Hand Theory. This is a podcast where we talk about the NBA and break things down from an analytical perspective. I'm your co-host, XJ. As always, he is my brilliant co-host, Geoff. And today, Geoff, we have another brilliant co-host with us. We have a very special guest, creator of the AlexHoops YouTube channel, huge in the basketball film analysis space, and the podcast, The Media Pass. We have AlexHoops. Alex, thanks for joining us. How are you doing, man?
Thanks for having me. I'm doing good. That was such a nice introduction. You covered all the bases. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I wanted to make sure to shout out the Media Pass because obviously your YouTube channel is huge. You know, had a ton of success there. Super insightful, breaking down basketball from a film perspective. But I think, you know, I've been listening to the Media Pass and it's an excellent podcast in of itself. So I just wanted also to make sure to shout that out too in your work on that end.
I really appreciate it. It's fun. Anytime people are like, yeah, we listen to the Media Pass, because podcasting is one of those things that like, it's hard to get, you guys understand, like it's a hard thing to get off the ground and like get people to listen. So anytime someone's like, oh, I love the Media Pass, so I listen to the Media Pass, I'm like, really? People listen to this?
Yeah, well, it's good. It's even if it's a high quality podcast, it's hard to get off the ground. So it's like, even if you have great analysis, super insightful stuff that you won't hear other places, there's just such competition in that space that it's like, you know, how are people making their choices for how they're going to spend, you know, an hour of their time to listen to basketball content? It's tough to beat, you know, to sort of beat out competition that way. So totally respect that. But at the same time, it's a great product. Yeah. So super happy to plug that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Geoff, what's up, my man? How are you doing?
I'm doing great. I just wanted to add to that I agree with everything you said about Alex's work, but one thing you didn't mention is that Alex actually also makes like original content. And I'm sure Alex is annoyed by now at how much I've shared a specific video of his. I've shared his video.
I know exactly what you're going to mention.
I've shared his video on Emmanuel Quickley's defense at least 75 times. That was like the first time. You know, we talk about biases on this podcast all the time. Everybody has them. Probably my biggest bias of the last 5 years has been Emmanuel Quickley when he was a Knick. I felt like I was at times on an island with thinking like he was this really good, impactful player. I really felt confident that his defense was better than people thought it was because, you know, he's just good at the point of attack. And people are like, oh, he's small, he can be exploited at the point of attack. And I was like, yeah, but he does so many other things off the ball that people aren't paying attention. And then all of a sudden, this video just pops up on my timeline. It's just like a 10-minute dedication to how good Quickley's off-ball defense. And I was like, who the hell is this guy? Finally, I felt so heard. So if anybody is interested, just go check out Alex's channel. He has original content like that where he does individual breakdowns using film and he narrates them, and they're just excellent, including that one.
I appreciate it. Thank you. This is awesome. You guys are inflating my ego right now.
Yeah, that's the entire podcast. That's what we had you on for, just to give you all your props. Something else we have you on for today, Alex, is to talk about our NBA awards. So we have, you know, at this point when people are listening to this, less than a week of NBA regular season basketball left. You know, obviously we're going to be turning to the play-in and the playoffs very soon in our coverage of the sport. So for this episode, we're going to go through our regular season NBA awards. We're going to share our Hot Hand Theory awards. So that's mine and Geoff's kind of combined awards. And then we're going to hear where Alex agrees or disagrees and then get his perspectives on where he would go with the awards. And I think it'll be a really fun episode. I'm excited to hear where you're coming from, Alex, and to see what you think about what we're thinking. I mean, I think some of our choices are going to be probably aligned with the kind of mainstream consensus, but then a lot of ours are probably not. So it'll be really interesting to break it down. We can jump in and get started. And I think it just makes sense. I mean, we're at the top of the show talking about the biggest award. The MVP race might be we'll see. Might be the most consensus we'll see so far. But yeah, Geoff, do you want to share where the Hot Hand Theory MVP race is kind of coming down to?
Yeah, so for each award, except for the All NBA teams, of course, we gave like a top three. So our top three MVPs were Jokic 1, Luka 2, SGA 3. I have to be honest, I feel like Jokic should probably run away with it at this point. I've been doing more and more research, and of course, we've always been big Jokic fans here. This kind of feels like a redemptive season for me and XJ, who took all the shit last season for saying that Jokic should have run away with it last season as well. But he hadn't won an NBA championship yet, so he couldn't, have earned the regular season MVP. I think, I don't want to cut Alex off before he even says anything, but unless Alex, thinks the MVP, the number one discussion is more interesting, I'm excited to hear his perspective about SGA versus Luka, because I think that they're two drastically different players in the way they impact, but they have some similarities and they're both amazing. I think you could put either at 2 or 3. We went Luka 2, we went SGA 3. Alex, is there anybody else who should be in the top 3 in your opinion? And do you have the same order, different order? What do you got for us?
So I would probably have the same exact order. There's not anyone else that I would put in there. I think that 3 is the top 3. I know some might throw Jason Tatum in there, which that's a whole other discussion that we don't need to get into. Nothing against Jason Tatum. I think Jason Tatum's a fantastic player. He's had a fantastic season. Celtics have had a fantastic season. The only thing I will say about the MVP award, and particularly your all selections, I don't disagree with your picks. I don't even disagree with the order, but I just want to acknowledge that Luka, the season that he's having, like, if Jokic didn't exist, Luka would probably run away with it. And B, if the West wasn't a historically insane Western Conference right now, Luka, if the Mavs are a top 4 seed, I feel like Luka, if he doesn't win it, at least it's a lot closer of a discussion between him and Jokic. I think it's already over the last 2 weeks, I've noticed the pulse on the MVP award has kind of narrowed drastically of it was Jokic by a landslide for a while. And then now over the last couple of weeks, it's oh, wow, the Mavs are only 2 games back from the Clippers at number 4. Man, Luka might have a dog in this fight. And I think he definitely does. I would still probably pick Jokic, but it's almost crazy that Luka's doing what he's doing. Any other year, he's probably MVP, but he's in a historically difficult Western Conference with one of the greatest players probably ever with Jokic. That's a crappy hand to be dealt.
That's tough shit for Luka there, being aligning his, I was going to say his prime, but Luka probably has a really long prime. He's only 25 years old. He has a lot of prime left. But yeah, I think that's a great point, Alex, because I think something that's super interesting to me about Luka's season specifically is his consistency. We often see a lot of these MVP races, the top guys kind of come and go early in the season. It's this guy. He's look at the ridiculous season that he's off to. Then that guy kind of fades, and then somebody else, comes through later on in the season. And it's oh, wait, this guy's taking it at the end. Luka Doncic has just been who he's been the entirety of the year. It's really remarkable to see. He's so consistent. He does the same things game in and game out. He's so consistently excellent. I mean, we've seen the Mavericks fluctuate in terms of their overall performance, but not his performance. I think a lot of that comes down to kind of Kyrie's been in and out, and then Kyrie's performance has fluctuated a little bit, but he's been awesome lately. So I think that's totally true. I do think it's probably a little closer between Luka and Jokic, and that's because, again, Luka's been super consistent. Jokic, I think, has been a little bit up and down, but I also think that's a little bit to be expected because Jokic has obviously done everything at this point, right? He should be in contention in my opinion. I know Geoff agrees, for his 4th consecutive MVP. And so it makes sense.
I'm with you there.
Yeah. Okay, good. That's I'm glad we're on the same page on that. So it makes sense for him to kind of, for the regular season, just not to have the same like oomph that it might have, coming off a championship. And he started out the regular season in his pure dominant form that he always has. And so it makes sense for him to have a little, some peaks and valleys throughout the season. But Luka's just been awesome through and through. Some of his numbers are just ridiculous in terms of his 3-point shooting. Now he's up to 10 attempts per 75, career high from there. And on top of that, he's shooting 38% on those threes, which are mostly off the dribble threes, which is completely ridiculous. Like it's prime, 15, 16 Steph Curry stuff in terms of his ability to shoot off the dribble at a much higher volume than Steph did in those days. So everything
it's better than any Harden season, right?
I think it is from
I think so.
Yeah.
I just think he's so much different than Steph. It's almost like a disservice to both players to compare them. I know that actually. I'm just saying and maybe it's unfair to Luka to just group him in with Harden because Harden was so heliocentric in Houston. And I feel like one of Luka's biggest leaps this season has been embracing Kyrie in a way that he really hasn't embraced a star in the past. Watched that crazy game they played against the Rockets the other day. And Kyrie and Luka were like hugging, arms around each other at half court after the game. It was an awesome game, awesome to see for Mavericks fans. And I do feel like Luka's changed his style. I do want to say, actually, I guess I'm going to push back a little bit here on how close the top two are. So let's start first with how good Luka's been. Luka is almost 10%. If you look at BPM, his BPM is almost 10% higher than anybody else in the NBA. The gap between him and third could be reasonably wide. Jokic's BPM is 30% higher than Luka's. So that's a good place to start right there. Then you look at impact on team. The Mavericks are great when Luka plays, obviously. They're 10 points worse offensively when Luka's on the bench, even with Kyrie Irving on the team. And I know Kyrie's been in and out, but the offense kind of falls off a cliff without Luka, and that's very telling. The Nuggets offense is 19 points worse per 100 possessions without Jokic. Whatever impact you think Luka is having on his team, it's so much more in Denver for what Jokic does there. He is the entire solar system there, and his output has just been better pretty much across the board. I mean, we're talking about the Nuggets have a 104.5 offensive rating when he doesn't play. And Malone has gotten better with staggering, with trying to keep Murray when he's healthy on the court without Jokic. And if you look at like the Wowie data, even Murray on, Jokic off, the numbers just aren't good. I think it's like 108 or something points per 100 possessions. They have 5 really, really good players who are very, very synergistic, but it's kind of nothing without Jokic. And I just think he's far and away the MVP again. And that's no disrespect to Luka. Luka's an amazing basketball player, but it's got to be Jokic.
Yeah, I think that's a totally valid line of argumentation there on the gap. I mean, to me, just looking at the impact stuff, at least like looking at BPM, for instance, a lot of that difference is made on the defensive side. And I think there's just a lot of noise in that data, especially whenever you look at Jokic's defensive impact metrics, it's often all over the place because, different ones weigh like rebounding differently and plus minus stuff differently. And I don't think that, Jokic is really like anchoring the defense to the extent that he be like, actually, okay, so in box plus minus that you were mentioning, he's number 1 in the NBA in defensive box plus minus. I don't think he's probably the most impactful defensive player in the league, ahead of, who do we have here? Wembanyama, Hartenstein, Giannis, SGA, Caruso, Mobley. I don't think he's a better defender than those guys. So I kind of look at those with a little bit of a grain of salt, just with how those are calculated. And how much and to what extent they weigh kind of plus minus into the equation. But I think I think it's totally fair. I wouldn't push back too much.
One thing you said about about defense in general a year or so ago that stuck with me is how underrated defensive rebounding can get. So looking at the on-off data, the Nuggets get 9% fewer defensive rebounds without Jokic on the court. He's a vacuum. And that, like, part of defending is finishing the stop and making sure that you get the ball to start the next possession. So, of course, I don't think Jokic is the most impactful defender in the NBA, but I do think that sometimes his defense is slept on. He has really, really good hands in passing lanes. They've started showing him higher at the level to sort of make it so switches don't occur and he's not in drop as much. So his rim protection isn't being as exposed. This is one of those things you talk about, XJ. His defensive impact is almost artificially being elevated by the scheme and by things that aren't traditional defensive, things that traditionally go into defensive impact.
For sure. Yeah. I think that's all totally right. Well said. Well, we don't have too much disagreement here. It sounds like our most of our disagreement is how big is the gap between Jokic and Luka Doncic, which is a funny way to kind of parse apart our differences here. Let's move over to our next award, which is the Defensive Player of the Year award, and see what the disagreement is there. I think there could be more here. From our end of things, Alex, the high hand theory, Defensive Player of the Year, top 3, we're giving the award to the rookie, Victor Wembanyama here. Number 2, we have Rudy Gobert, and number 3, we have Bam Adebayo. I think we Geoff and I had a pretty lengthy text message conversation between Wemby and Gobert. The big difference between those two in terms of why I feel like Gobert was really in the conversation is the team performance overall. So obviously the Timberwolves have incredible defense. I think they're number 1 in the NBA defensively, if I remember correctly. Whereas obviously the San Antonio Spurs are very certainly not in that conversation. But at the same time, when you look at some of the on-off stuff, it's really completely insane from a defensive standpoint. Victor Wembanyama is the Spurs defense. They're 10 points better on defense when Wembanyama plays than when he doesn't play. There's no other player in the NBA has a swing like that. With Wembanyama's played over 2,000 minutes, with even players who play like 1,000 minutes or something like that. No one's close to that. He's a defense in a box. He's almost like a heliocentric defensive player with how he impacts the defense. And, although Rudy Gobert has been that in the past, I think this year he certainly has much better insulation around him with some of the wings that the Timberwolves put out there and some of the time that he's been able to be an impactful defender without Karl Anthony Towns, which has certainly helped him as well. So that's kind of why we decided to go with Wemby. What are your thoughts there, Alex?
Yeah, your top 3 is the same as my top 3. I personally have Gobert number 1. Not trying to discredit anything that Wemby's done this year. I do think in the Spurs games that I've watched, I have noticed a lot of like rookie things from him. He's fantastic defensively already. He, like you said, he's a defense in a box, but I do think positionally he still makes his fair share of mistakes. And can kind of get caught in no man's land sometimes, get caught in like dead spots on the floor, and good offenses are definitely able to still take advantage of that. And that's not to say that's, Rudy Gobert never has points where he isn't able to get kind of picked on is maybe not the right word, but taken advantage of defensively. He certainly does. But one thing I want to say about Gobert that I've noticed it popping up a little bit more, and a lot of people are starting to take a little bit more notice on it. He has been pretty decent on the perimeter this year. I've always kind of felt like his perimeter defense has been underrated. It's not the right word, but the concerns that people have about it, it's oftentimes overblown and usually more of a sign of poor team defense rather than his individual problems. But this year specifically, someone posted a clip of it, and it's something I've noticed in games a lot this year. When Gobert has somebody on the perimeter and it's like a primary ball handler, and that ball handler is like trying to pick on Rudy because they have Rudy on an island, they end up settling for a contested mid-range jumper a lot. And I think like, okay, yeah, you may be a 7+ footer out there on the perimeter, but if you can get guys to settle for tough mid-range jumpers, you've won. And, even if they make them, it's like, okay, whatever. I'll defensively and mathematically, from like a coaching perspective, you live with that. If you get a tough shot maker to take and either make or miss a tough mid-range jumper, it's like, fine, whatever. That's fine. While Wemby's defensive impact is fantastic, I don't necessarily, I'm kind of pulling that out of my calculus from defensive player of the year because the Spurs are just so horrendous defensively without Wemby. So it's like, yes, I think Wemby's incredibly impactful. That's not to say he isn't, but also those numbers get inflated when your team just sucks so incredibly bad defensively. So I'm not to discredit like how impressive that number is, but it's also like the Spurs are also impressively bad defensively without him. I think they're like one of the worst defenses ever without him on the floor. And then Gobert, it's like the thing that I'm really looking at is like rim deterrence. Like the shot blocking, yes, I understand Wemby's going to win the shot blocking battle every time, which I don't really love blocks as like a indicator of defensive impact. I'm much higher on rim deterrence and rim protection numbers, as well as like how much more often are teams attempting mid-range shots when you're on the floor versus when you're off. That's another really good sign of rim deterrence. When Rudy's on the floor, I believe teams attempt 5.2 percentage points more shots at the rim, 5.2 percentage points more frequently when he's on the floor versus off. And despite the fact that the Spurs are so bad defensively, that number for Wemby is only 2.3 percentage points. So it's like, yeah, they're not attempting shots at the rim. They're attempting them roughly the same rate is what I'm trying to say for the Spurs, as opposed to with Gobert. It's like that impact drastically changes when he's on the floor. And like a shot at the rim is still, aside from a free throw, a shot at the rim is still the most efficient shot in basketball. And then you look at the efficiency numbers and they're roughly the same. It's just, I think Gobert, with really what I'm trying to say is I think Gobert's polish as a defender is what really sets him apart. I think the highs for Wemby are so high that like, yes, it gets him in the conversation, but with Gobert, it's like, I love the known variable of Gobert. It's like, okay, yes, you know what you're getting, and it's going to be really freaking good. And if you can surround him with the right players, that defense is going to be insane. And then the Timberwolves' defensive success kind of speaks for itself this season. If there was like a most valuable defensive player of the year, I think I would have Wemby number one for that. But for me, defensive player of the year is like, okay, top to bottom, beginning to end of the season, how were you as a defender, and how did that impact your team's success? And even though the Timberwolves are still such a great defensive team, even without Gobert, it's like Gobert's still Gobert. He's still doing what he's always done. And yeah, he's my number one, but also anyone who has Wemby number one, I'm like, yeah, that's fine. I totally understand because he's insane. It's ridiculous. It's one of the wildest things I've ever seen in my life.
Yeah, I mean, so many great points by you. I love the point you made about Gobert's perimeter defense. I think I don't know what he has to do to get the stink of the 2021 playoffs off of him. I think that, the Jazz were the number one seed that season. They got a Clippers team that didn't have Kawhi Leonard, and Ty Lue just said, I'm going to play Terrence Mann at center. And for whatever, I mean, yes, that did mitigate Gobert's impact. But the point you made that actually it said a little bit more about his teammates than it did him, that was everything. Because you go back and rewatch that season, Ingles and Mitchell, they're getting torched at the point of attack, and it's on Gobert to basically play 1-on-2 between a guy in the corner and a guy going to the rim. And they didn't have, for Knicks fans out there who watch the Knicks, one of their favorite tactics is if you get beat at the point of attack, you have to tail off and help the guy in the corner who's helping you. And that is something Thibodeau preaches. Quinn Snyder wasn't exactly preaching that in Utah that season. So they basically had their pick anytime down the court of open corner three or open layup. And Gobert single-handedly had to try and stop that. So I'm not saying it's not at all his fault because, if you're a rim protector who isn't as mobile, what Ty Lue proved in those playoffs is that can be exploited, but you also have to beat the guy at the point of attack too. It's multi-layered. The last takeaway I have from this, and then I'll turn it over to XJ, is, you said, I don't think Wemby is defensive player of the year, but if there was a most valuable defender, I think Wemby was it. And other things you said were, I saw rookie warts. He's not polished as Gobert. Like, what are we going to see when he's polished and when he doesn't have the rookie warts? What's going to occur then? Because I agree with you. There are things, like his defensive rebounding, for example. It's been good, and the Spurs have been way worse when he's not on the court. But at times he has been a little bit exploitable by bigger guys who take that matchup personally. You can see it. They're pushing him around, and yeah, Wemby's held his own a lot of times, but there have been times when he hasn't. What's going to happen when he gets stronger and guys can't do that anymore? Like, it's kind of scary that this is just the tip of the iceberg for this guy. And there's like a pretty reasonable argument that he was the most valuable defender this season. And there are a lot of areas he can improve.
I think, like, regardless of who wins it this year, after this year, I don't think anyone's winning a defensive player of the year other than Wemby for a really long time. I think it's going to be Wemby's for like the next however long he's, a fully healthy player in his prime. It's over. It's over.
It's like when Nadal beat Federer at the French Open in 2005, and I forget what announcer it was, but he played a match a few years later, and the guy was like, Nadal hit a shot, and he turned and looked at the crowd, and he was like, Nadal's going to be 65 years old and still winning this stupid tournament. Like, he just started ranting to the fans. That's going to be Wemby with Defensive Player of the Year.
Yeah, you made so many great points there, and I think that the one that Geoff nailed down on is the one that stood out to me, where you said, you would probably make him most valuable defender versus defensive player of the year. I think for me, I kind of look at defensive player of the year as most valuable defender. But I think obviously the NBA puts these vague terms and then leaves it up to your interpretation, which is, I think, is intentional to allow people to have different interpretations of the award. So I just think that's really interesting. And I probably would agree, because it's sort of the opposite of the argument we were making when we're talking about Luka Doncic in terms of his consistency. I think Rudy Gobert's been the equivalent in that standpoint from the defensive end, just kind of night in and night out, doing everything that it takes to anchor an elite defense. He's been that consistent person. Wemby, with the high highs and some lower lows, I think just on balance, to me, is where he's just like a little bit better, but it's also just like kind of all over the place. Like, there are nights when he does look like, I don't mean this offensively, but like kind of like a baby giraffe, where it's like he's kind of like gangly and can get kind of like pushed around a little bit and maybe turns the wrong way and makes a mistake. And you just rarely see that happen with Gobert. To your point about Gobert's defense kind of on switches and holding his own on the perimeter, in isolation, I just looked it up, and obviously this is subject to some of the NBA's, the way that they track some of this stuff.
Yeah.
In isolation, Gobert is only giving up 0.7 points per possession as an isolation defender this year, which is 90th percentile in the NBA. So he's been incredible guarding one-on-one on the perimeter. That's an unbelievable stat. I don't know what his career numbers are, but I can't imagine they've been anywhere near close to that. So I think it's totally valid, obviously, to have Gobert there. And in all honesty, Geoff was pushing more for Gobert to be Defensive Player of the Year. I pushed pretty hard back to have Wemby. So I think you could really go either way. Anything you want to add there before we move on, Alex?
I think it's a complete toss up this year. I think we'll probably see a pretty heavy split in the voter base.
For sure.
Do you guys see a shift coming soon in terms of, I know we just said that Wemby's going to win it for a while, but with the league moving more and more towards 3-point shooting and getting smaller, Marcus Smart won Defensive Player of the Year in 2022. And if you go back and look at those numbers, he probably wasn't the guard that should have won when it a guard, like it probably should have been Drew Holiday that year. If you were going to give it to a guard, not even sure you should have given it to a guard. Do you think we'll see like more wings and guards enter the fray of this discussion, or is it just a big man's award because rim protection is so important?
I think there's like a spectrum that Wemby is able to escape from, where like the spectrum is you either have to be so insane at defense that like you can be like a meh offensively, because like Rudy Gobert, let's use him as an example. He's just such an incredible defender, due in part to the fact that he is an insanely talented defender instinctively, and just like technique wise. But another part of it is just he's so freaking tall and he's so freaking strong, and he has an insane wingspan that allows you to be an insanely impactful defender and then a meh on offense. I think Gobert's been a little underrated this year offensively. Different discussion. Then you look at a guy, let's use another example of, let's use Frank
Ntilikina.
Frank Ntilikina. Frank Ntilikina. That's a better one. Frank Ntilikina, it's like, okay, a better one to use is Aaron Gordon, for example. Aaron Gordon's a very, 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 very good defender out of the wing position. And offensively, he's like, he can't really shoot. He can't really space the floor super well, but he knows where to be, and he plays alongside Jokic, so it's able to kind of handle some of his offensive drawbacks. With a guy like Wemby, he's able to escape this box of like, okay, we can live with you being meh offensively because you're so dang good defensively. Wemby is able to be insanely good defensively without sacrificing anything offensively. And like the effort exertion that you have as a defender to win a defensive player, like Marcus Smart, he was able to exert that level of energy on defense because he's not the focal point of the offense. Wemby can be the focal point of your defense and the focal point of your offense, and he's going to exert the same amount of energy no matter what. So like say for one season, Wemby's just like, I don't care about how I am as an offensive player. I'm going to invest 100% of my energy in defense. That would be like the most ridiculous defensive season we've ever seen from a player ever, probably, if I had to guess. You could do the same like argument for like a Hakeem Olajuwon. If Hakeem Olajuwon just decided, you know what, I don't care about offense this year, I'm going 100% defense. It's just not even going to be a discussion. So my point with all of this, to answer your question, is the player that does kind of surpass Wemby in this discussion or get into the conversation would have to be like a wing who is 100% defense and like a nothing on offense. And the only reason I don't see that happening, and I talked about it in a podcast episode recently, is like the non-offensive wings are dying, and it's going to be really hard for like that player to exist in the modern NBA unless you have the infrastructure to accommodate them.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I definitely an amazing point. I want to, because I know we want to move to the next one, but I do want to unpack this a little bit because that's such an interesting perspective. When you say a nothing on offense, do you mean, so I'm thinking of a guy like, like a Herb Jones or like an OG Anunoby, a guy who wreaks havoc completely on the defensive end, and that's where most of their energy is expended. But on the offensive end, where they add, is just through their spacing, primarily their ability to knock down shots. They're not like a focal point. They're not doing a ton of creation. They don't necessarily have to move a ton. OG does move a lot on offense, cutting and screening, but don't necessarily have to use their energy on that end as much, but still be a positive impact player at that end of the court, just through like passive spacing. I'm in the corner, you can't leave me, and it's going to allow Jalen Brunson to get all the way to the rim because he has so much space to work with. Would that still count to you, or do you think? I mean, like we watch OG a lot. I mean, obviously we watch a ton of Knicks, and so we see OG a lot. And he, when he's turned on, he wreaks havoc on the defensive end. There's a ton of energy expended that way, and offensively, he doesn't really have to do as much. So, do you think a situation like that is possible to kind of offset the way that Wemby is able to impact both ends, or do you think that wouldn't be enough from a wing?
It would depend on the team and kind of what the requirements are for them, like depending on the team that's surrounding them. But like OG is a good example because OG, like, yeah, for the most part, he's going to be shooting threes. He's a great cutter, good screener, all of that. But I do think OG is still another example of like, okay, I'm sure he's giving like 100% defensively of like what you want him giving defensively. But there is still probably another level to his defense of like, okay, you could take it up a notch. And we see it in clutch time. Like a lot of times you'll see players ramp that defense up to 11, those guys that can do that. But what the problem that you run into in this theoretical scenario of like, okay, OG Anunoby, for example, you have him giving 110% defensively. One of the first things that's going to start to go is the jump shot. He's going to start getting fatigue. He's not going to get his legs under his shot. He's going to start missing short a lot. And it's like, yeah, maybe in certain situations in clutch time, you live with that trade-off when you're putting the ball in Brunson's hands and letting him go to work in isolation and relying on him to make a shot. Last 5 minutes of a game, you can live with that because OG's not going to be taking a ton of shots, maybe just one or two when the defense starts helping off. But over the course of an entire 48-minute game, over the course of an entire 82-game season, it's like, how sustainable does that become? Is it sustainable at all? And OG, like you said, yeah, he's good at shooting threes. He's good at cutting. He's physical. And that's the big thing that I've kind of realized with non-shooting wings or non-offensive wings is they rely on physicality. So even if their defense is already very, very good, even elite, there's always that next level. And the first thing that you're going to start trading off on the offensive end is the physicality and the stuff that's going to get impacted by fatigue.
Yeah, I think this is a great. This just really caught my attention because this is something I think about a lot and have thought about more recently, which is just energy trade-offs, right? Like energy expenditure, how a player chooses to use their energy on which end of the court, on what plays, all those kinds of things. And I think that's something that's not really talked about enough. So that's why this is such an interesting conversation to me. So I think that's spot on.
It's also
Jeff,
like
yeah, go ahead,
it's also like a facsimile of our clone theory, which is like, or like a branch on the tree. Basically, Alex, we've been positing that because of the influx of talent in the NBA these days, synergy is probably as important as it's ever been across the league. And no longer is it just, let's just get the most talent. It's how can we make sure that as many guys on the court are 100% of themselves at all times or as much as possible. And this started because XJ, the genius that he is, asked a very simple question, which was, do you think the Knicks would rather have two Jalen Brunsons, but they weren't allowed to play together, or Jalen Brunson and Julius Randle? And we just sort of went down that rabbit hole. And it kind of occurred to us that 48 minutes of Jalen Brunson surrounded by additive players is probably better than Jalen Brunson and a really good player in Julius Randle, but one who frankly is kind of diminishing, who when he's at his best, now Jalen Brunson isn't at his best. It's hard for the two of them because they're not interactive to be 100% of themselves at the same time. And so we kind of went down that rabbit hole and we realized that synergy and these sorts of additive players like an OG Anunoby are as important as they've ever been.
That's a really fun thought experiment. I think you could do that with a lot of teams and you would get very interesting answers. Yeah.
If just go across the league there, we determined that right now there are 3 teams in the entire NBA who wouldn't qualify as clone theory teams. And that's the Nuggets, Celtics, and Bucks. Just basically teams. And the Bucks everyone knows they're struggling right now, but I think most reasonable people would agree that from a profile wise, they're pretty optimally built. Giannis and Dame they're 2 of the more additive superstars that you can get. But aside from them, you look at, the combinations of players on a lot of these teams, and it's like, okay, would the Hawks be better off with both Murray and Trae Young, or would they be better off with one of them and, a super role player in their role? It's a really interesting thought experiment. We've been talking a lot about it the last month or so.
Yeah. I'm glad Clone Theory made an appearance here. We try to shoehorn it into every episode that we.
That's awesome. I'm going to be thinking about that a lot now. I love it.
Yeah, appreciate that. All right, let us go over to the Sixth Man of the Year award. Let's talk about that for Sixth Man of the Year. Geoff, do you wanna share our Sixth Man of the Year award?
Sure. So we have Bogdan Bogdanovic winning.
I was
And then
gonna. So that was one thing I was like, surely they're not talking about Boyan. I figured it was. I figured it was Bogdan. I was like, this could get weird.
Yeah,
It would've gotten very weird.
no, definitely not Boyan. Although he's been better lately for the Knicks. The last few games. Second, Malik Monk, and then third, get ready, people, Obi Toppin. I assume that, look, the interesting thing about six man is you can go in so many different directions. Context, like there's different contexts everywhere. We're rarely speaking in a point of, self-assuredness. We're always open to being wrong. But I think with this award specifically, you can go in any number of different directions and we wouldn't say, yeah, you're wrong. So, Alex, what do you think of our picks, and who are some names we may have missed?
So there's only one name that I would probably have on here in place of one. Give me the 60-second elevator pitch on Obi Toppin.
XJ. Tag, you're in, XJ. He's been waiting for this. He's been waiting for this all year.
Yeah, I'm not gonna hype it up too much. I mean, no. So I think the thing about Obi Toppin is the only I'll give you the anti-elevator pitch, which is that he had his best impact as a starter. But for me, the Sixth Man of the Year award is not really about when you had your best impact. Was it coming off the bench or as a starter? It's just a player who's a sixth man, essentially, who has started fewer games than they've come off the bench, what their overall impact has been on the season for the team. And I think that Obi Toppin has completely flown under the radar in terms of his importance to the Pacers. When he was a starter for the Pacers and before they got Siakam and they had Bruce Brown, actually the Pacers had, I think they had a top three in terms of the 5-man lineups in the entire NBA in terms of plus minus. And that was over like 500 possessions. So at the point when we would start to say, yeah, this is like a legitimate sample size. So we would say this is not just a matter of good fortune or luck or variance. Like this team is actually performing in this way. So they already had that with Obi as a starter. And the reason is because he was a perfect fit there. Like in terms of what he provides relative to what another player could at his role, he was ideal. I mean, he's shooting 41% from three on the season on pretty good volume, is one of the best finishers in the entire league. He's 97th percentile in rim finishing. He's finishing 74.3% of his attempts at the rim. Obviously, a ton of those are layups, dunks, transition attempts, but that's exactly what they've needed. And then obviously I'm mentioning he's shooting a ridiculous percentage at the rim, a ridiculous percentage from three. His true shooting is completely off the charts. His efficiency has been incredible for them. And he's just been the perfect additive piece to a Tyrese Halliburton run offense from that position. Now, his impact was pretty sizably diminished once they made the Siakam trade, which would make sense. His minutes were reduced. His usage was reduced. His role was kind of changed. But after that, maybe like the first 10 games of Siakam, he's really started to take off again. And just looking at, for instance, I love impact metrics a ton just because they are top-down metrics that kind of contain everything that a player could be doing to impact the team, not just in terms of their points, rebounds, or assists or any of that, but everything that he could be doing. And he's gone completely off the charts again. In terms of overall impact, let's say I'm looking at estimated plus minus EPM, LeBron, BPM, all of those kinds of impact metrics. Actually, Obi Toppin is probably nets out as the best impact player of all of the candidates that I have for sixth man of the year, which I think most people would be surprised by, but the data is the data there. So that's largely why I have him again, and he's third on this list. He's not a top two, or I wouldn't even say he's probably a candidate to even finish in the top two based on voting. But I do think it's just an unheralded player that hasn't gotten the kind of due that he should, given his impact on the Pacers throughout the entire season. So that's kind of like my elevator pitch for a top, and just being third on Sixth Man of the Year.
So the two names that I would throw out there, the top two that you have, I think, are probably two of the biggest candidates for sure. One that I've seen thrown out pretty heavily and pretty often. He's actually been starting lately, I believe. Naz Reid is one who I would probably have on my ballot. But actually over him, I would most likely have Norman Powell. I think Norman Powell has had an insanely underrated season. I think he's just generally an underrated player overall. Defensively, obviously, like, it's Norman Powell. We're not going to sit here and I'm not going to try and sell you on Norman Powell's defense because no one who's watched any Clippers game is going to buy it. But Norman Powell on the season, 14 points, roughly 50% from the field, 43% from three on 5 attempts a night. A very underrated foul grifter, which I hate giving guys credit for that, but man, he's really good at it. One of the best in the league. One of the stats that really just like sells me on Norman Powell as like the perfect sixth man. And it's another thing that you can kind of say about Malik Monk and why I think Malik Monk will probably win it this year, which is fine. He probably is who I would vote for number one. But Norman Powell, when he's on the floor, the 5-man lineup of James Harden, Norman Powell, Paul George, Kawhi Leonard, and Zubats, in the 236 possessions that they've played together, isn't a super massive sample size, but still decent sample size. They are plus 31.8, that 5-man lineup. And this is something me and my co-host Matt Issa, we've been talking a lot about what's the Clippers closing lineup. I think that is the closing lineup for the Clippers. Harden, Powell, George, Leonard, Zubats. Their offensive rating is in the 91st percentile, 132.6 points per 100 possessions. And defensively, they allow 100.8. In the half court, those numbers get even more mind-boggling. 109.6 points per 100 half court possessions. And then defensively, I think they still hold water very well, allowing 91.7 points per 100 possessions in the half court. He just like is kind of the embodiment of the 6th man of the year award for me. And then Naz Reid's, it's funny because Naz Reid, we see the 6th man of the year award go primarily to guards a lot of the time, because that's like normally your quintessential 6th man is the microwave scorer coming off the bench, your Cole Anthony's, your Jamal Crawford's, your Norm Powell's, Malik Monk's, guys like that.
Malcolm Brogdon.
Malcolm Brogdon. Naz Reid is
I'm not bitter at all. Not even not at all. I had quickly plus 15,000 last year. I had him in January. That was
Quickly one of the my pick last year. I thought he should have won.
I was sitting around like he was at one point minus 500 on DraftKings. I'm like counting my money, and then all of a sudden the Boston media comes out of nowhere and they're like, "No, not so fast. We got an agenda to push here."
Yeah, it was brutal.
Anyway, sorry to interrupt, but
no, you're fine. But Naz Reid is interesting just because he's like, oh, it's a big man, but then you watch Naz Reid play and it's like, oh, it's a big man playing like a guard, like there, and he's I'll be honest. I don't know if there's 3 big men in the NBA with a better handle than Naz Reid. That dude handles, you talk about like a big with guard skills. That dude handles the ball like a guard. He moves like a guard. It's like mind blowing seeing him move during a game. It's like, oh, you're not supposed to be able to do that. Like, that's weird. And you talk about guys who are built to handle Wemby. Go watch Naz Reid tape versus Wemby this year. You're going to see a guy that gives Wemby fits. Like, you can tell Wemby's just like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do against this guy. And like every GM's like, we need a Naz Reid for the future, because apparently that's the only guy who can cook Victor Wembanyama on a nightly basis.
And a couple of things that are related to conversations we've had earlier in this pod, but then also like beginning of the season type stuff. Naz Reid synergistically is almost the perfect bench big for Minnesota. I know Towns isn't healthy anymore, but his ability to toggle between power forward and center next to Towns and Gobert it's almost impossible to fully capture the value of that, because it elevates both Towns and Gobert and allows them, when they play with Naz Reid, to be the best versions of themselves. Like, oh, Towns is, because, you know, we've all watched Towns Towns loves, starting from the perimeter, but getting to the inside. That's harder when Gobert's on the court. Oh, okay, we'll just throw Naz Reid out there and Naz Reid can space for you. And, Gobert likes protecting the rim. We know that. He wants to guard fives. Naz Reid can slide with power forwards, and he can also protect the rim. Towns' weakness is Towns isn't as good as a rim protector as he should be. Okay, Naz Reid is in the 83rd percentile in block percentage. He checks all the boxes that the team needs him to check at the moment he's on the court, whether it's Gobert or Towns on the court with him. And then he's also can shoot and can block shots. So if Gobert and Towns are out, he can just be the center, and all of a sudden you have this 5-out offense that it still exists well. They do fine when Naz Reid is on the court without either of them. So it's really interesting. He's a really unique player. And we were talking about team synergy earlier. I do think he's kind of slept on. I'm surprised that neither me or XJ brought him up in the conversation. He's just an excellent basketball player.
Yeah, I agree. I think the Naz Reid pick is the one that's like, yeah, Naz should probably be in there just in terms of everything you said, Geoff, everything you both said, his versatility. I think something I think a lot about, which is obvious based on what we were talking about with clone theory, is what if I swap this player out for someone else? And it feels really difficult to imagine the Timberwolves being as successful if I swap Naz Reid out for like anyone else that I could think of, especially at his dollar figure in terms of his salary. There's not really anybody I could think of that'd be like, yeah, I put that guy in there and it would be just as good. There's not really anyone. But what I would say is, in terms of the Norman Powell one, I'm not sure that I feel like the opposite on that. I feel like I could swap in a lot of guys for Norm Powell, and because I guess, and you probably watch more Clippers than I do, Alex, so you can push back on this and let me know if I'm wrong. I feel like all Norm Powell does is shoot threes. Like I feel, and at a ridiculous clip, 44% or whatever he's shooting this season is awesome, but at least from a perspective of like the games that I've watched and the data that I've looked at, he doesn't do much of anything else. Like he doesn't create very much. He doesn't rebound very much. He doesn't, get a bunch of steals. I mean, he's not a good defender. You mentioned his ability to kind of be a foul grifter. I think he does that a little bit, but his free throw rate is still like under league average by a little bit. So I think last year or obviously like the past, like I'm looking at his basketball reference right now, the past 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years, he's been an incredible free throw rate player, way over league average. But this year he's at 93 in terms of his free throw rate adjusted, which compares to league average with 100 being league average. So this has been an underwhelming season for him specifically in terms of getting to the line. So I just feel like he's a guy I see as like, that's a replaceable player. And some players could play his role even better than he does at his dollar figure, especially. Whereas I see Naz Reid as the opposite. Like I can't even imagine a player to replace him. So I think that's why I would probably say I would be okay with putting Naz in over Obi. I don't know. I'd be okay with putting Norman over Obi necessarily.
Oh, I would have Naz over Norm Powell for sure. And definitely like, I agree that the player archetype of a Norman Powell is definitely replaceable. But also like there's ultimately only so many teams that have guys in that role because only so many teams like need a guy in that role. It's not always even necessarily a good thing if your team needs a player like that. Ultimately it can be a sign of a poorly constructed roster.
True.
I won't say any names here, but teams like that do currently exist that have a player like that. And you maybe don't want to be in that situation. The Clippers may not want to be in the situation. They've sucked lately. So
yeah.
But also, as replaceable as the player archetype might be, we're discussing Sixth Man of the Year, and it's not about the archetype. It's about the player output. And he's in the 97th percentile in three-point shooting. So, like, I do think it's a little bit misleading to just be like, oh, well, there are lots of players who look like Norman Powell. So I don't think anybody could shoot 44% on high volume from three. And like Alex has talked about, be a part of some of these super awesome lineups where his gravity and 3-point shooting is additive to a lineup that has all three of Harden, George, and Kawhi. You need someone who can snipe and not touch the ball too much. Whether or not there are tons of people who could do it, Powell did actually do it, and he did it at a high level. I think that's worth considering. I know XJ and I kind of disagree here. We've actually debated a bit about like the Cy Young. I've created hypotheticals where a pitcher had the highest, line drive percentage allowed in MLB history, but they all happened to go to fielders and had a 0 ERA. And XJ is like, well, yeah, but he still wouldn't have had a good season. He just had a lucky season. So our process here, or excuse me, some of the conclusions we draw are a little different. I'm not saying I'm right or I'm not saying XJ is wrong. I understand where XJ is coming from. I just happen to believe that whether or not the theoretical version of what Powell is or who he is replaceable, in terms of deciding this award, how replaceable his archetype is almost doesn't matter. It's the output that we're debating here, and his output has been very, very good, at least at the offensive end.
Yeah, it's like the discussion of like, oh, they had anytime like a team wins a championship, everyone goes and looks at like the injuries up and down the rosters of the teams that they played. It's like, well, you play the team that's in front of you. It's like anytime I'm evaluating awards, it's like, well, yeah, historically, is this archetype as valuable as another? It's like, well, maybe not, but ultimately I'm just evaluating the players that are in front of me. And Norm Powell's definitely popped. I will say, we talk about his 3-point shooting a lot. I will say, I think he's actually very underrated attacking closeouts. He's attempting 10 shots a night, and only 5.1 of those per game are threes. So he still has 5 other shots a game that are normally coming outside of 3-point range. And he's shooting 49% overall. I think he's got kind of a nasty floater. That's something you'll see him do a lot, is like, okay, they're running him off the 3-point line, hard closeout, attack the closeout. Oh, they're waiting for me in the paint. All right, I'm just going to burn you with this little floater, like just outside the restricted area. And that's a lot of what his game is. And I think blurring the lines between the on and off ball stuff is like kind of what almost sets him enough apart from that player archetype to where I'm like, oh, he's not just another Jamal Crawford. It's like, no, he can do what you need him to do. And I think we've seen that with the Clippers this year, and why he's able to be maximized the way he is.
And just to add to your point, it's not like he's in the 78th percentile in 3-point attempts, but he's also in the 68th percentile in mid-range attempts, and he's decently efficient from the mid-range. So he is, and I think he's around average at the rim as well. He's a little below average, 42nd percentile in rim attempts, but he's efficient at the rim. So I'm hesitant to call him a 3-level scorer, but I do think it's more than just firing from 3 and that's it.
Yeah, he's like a 2.25 level scorer.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm looking at his shot density, and they're definitely, most of his shots are in from the mid range, are in that kind of floater range that you were just talking about, Alex. So he's not like pulling up for like long mid range shots. He's getting closer to the rim, and if he can't get all the way to the rim, he's pretty good at scoring just outside of that area at the basket. So definitely all totally strong and valid points here. Let's continue moving forward. Let's go to our most improved player. And I just want to say for this one, this was the most difficult one for me, honestly. There's so many different ways you could look at this award in terms of so some of the choices that Geoff was kind of sharing. I felt like we're all in this group of like, we're already like pretty good and then became really good or excellent. But there's also this group of players who were like bad and then became like pretty good or good. And so it's like, is it just the delta? Is it just like how far they've come from where they started? Or is it like that plus whatever their impact level is now? I think that's kind of some of the discussion around this award and who should earn it. I think we kind of split the difference here in terms of our top 3. So we went with winning the award, Jalen Williams, J-Dub from the Oklahoma City Thunder. And then we had Jalen Suggs and Deuce McBride finishing it out. And again, you'll obviously notice that these 3 players are either some of the kind of first description that I gave and some of the second, and maybe Jalen Suggs is kind of in the middle, but that's kind of where we went. What are your thoughts here on those 3, Alex?
So just to give you guys like an idea of like my philosophy towards this award, this is definitely a lot more of a like vibes award. I'm a sucker for a good like most improved player story. Obviously, like we've talked very quantitatively about a lot of these awards. This is one where I'm kind of just like, how good of a story is this? So normally I'm not I'm not a big fan of giving it to second year players, just because it's like, I would hope you improved your first to second year, especially if you get like an increased usage. I feel like that's a typical improvement arc. I look for like outlier development trajectories when I'm looking at most improved players. So like, oh wow, you've been in the league for like 5 years, and then all of a sudden your 6th year you figured it out. Like that doesn't really happen. Like it's pretty rare for that to happen. Suggs, I like the Suggs shout a lot. Even though Suggs in his 4th year, 4th year, 4th year. So I'm not a big fan of second year players, 3rd year players. I'm a little more willing to say give it to a 3rd year.
It's 3rd year. Sorry, Alex. It's 3rd year, but
well, that's fine. He still fits kind of the good story vibe for me, because it was like during the offseason, I had a lot of discussions with a lot of people where they're like, I don't know if Jalen Suggs is a long-term fit with the Magic. Like they might need to consider moving him. And it was like, is he going to be able to shoot threes at a high volume? Is he going to be able to shoot them fast enough and demand a closeout with like a quick enough release? Is he going to be able to come off screens and shoot at a high enough efficiency? And everyone was like, probably not, because we have 2 years of data that's like, oh, he can't shoot threes. He just might not be able to shoot threes. And then this year it's like, oh, okay. You not only can you shoot off the catch now, you're creating threes for yourself. We're having you come off screens and be a movement shooter sometimes. It's like, sweet, you can stay. And that's a situation of like, okay, you're a 3rd year player, but you fit the spirit of the award to me, of like, everyone was kind of out on you. And they're like, yeah, he's probably not going to figure it out. And then all of a sudden, oh, he figured it out. He can stay. And he's also an elite defender. Sweet. So I like the Suggs shout. Deuce McBride. I'm going to need an elevator pitch here.
Yeah, I Geoff, do you want to give it? I'm happy to give it here. It's a pretty straightforward one for Deuce McBride.
I'm happy to turn it over to you, XJ. XJ is the face of the operation here.
Inaccurate, but I'll say for Deuce McBride, again, it's a pretty straightforward one. This is a pure Delta discussion here. Deuce McBride, let's just start with his efficiency. His first 2 years, he was in the 1st percentile in true shooting, 1st percentile in effective field goal percentage year 1, 4th percentile in true shooting, 5th percentile in effective field goal percentage in year 2. So we're talking low single digits in terms of his efficiency for his first 2 years. This year, 70th percentile in true shooting, 74th percentile in effective field goal percentage. His 3-point shooting went from 25 to 29 to 42 to this year. Free throw shooting 66, 67 to 86 this year. His turnovers have maintained, if not gone down. He's been a better creator. He's been better as a defensive player. He just has gotten better in every aspect of the game. And again, like I just mentioned, like Delta, we're talking about a late draft pick that wasn't really expected to do very much and didn't his first 2 years, and then now is suddenly 65 games into his 3rd year, an essential piece for the Knicks, a rotation player, somebody who's playing 42 to 48 minutes on some nights, creating really essential space for Jalen Brunson. It's just been an invaluable piece to the Knicks and has helped them stay afloat. It's really, I mean, from a narrative perspective, honestly, I think it's a pretty impressive narrative. Just considering where he, his draft pick equity and all of that stuff. So I think he really squarely fits into this conversation personally. And I think I'm trying to even think of a way that he wouldn't. And I guess it would just be like, he didn't play as much his first 2 years, so you would expect him to improve with more playing time. I think that'd be the way you kind of push him out. Not you, but like a person would push him out. But just from the perspective of like what he's been able to do relative to where you might have had his kind of benchmark at, it's been really incredible. And I don't even think we see it that often, honestly. So that's the elevator pitch for McBride.
Yeah, I like that. Just to give you guys an idea of who like my pick for the award, like my number one, you guys sold me enough on the McBride pick that I'm like, yeah, sure, why not? That's fine. I don't have much pushback. I think I was someone who was always like, everyone cited his efficiency last couple of years, and it's like, well, he doesn't really play that much. And I'm a big believer in like, I think Kyle Kuzma actually said this quote, and it's a quote that I like watch basketball and live by now. It's hard to be consistent in an inconsistent role. And like, I think that's a situation where you can look at Miles McBride. It's like, well, yeah, no wonder he shot like crap his first 2 years. Like he got no chance to develop consistency. So
we
yes,
100% agree with that, by the way. Yeah, totally agree with that philosophy. Yep.
I like that pick. My pick for the award, just to show you all like kind of where I'm at with it. Kobe White. I think Kobe White fits everyone was kind of just like, yeah, you know what? Kobe White is what he is. You know, last year, 9 points per game. Not super duper, not inefficient, but nothing really to write home about. Not a big focal point of the offense because it just doesn't seem like he's going to be able to handle that responsibility. Almost has been declining since his rookie year. And then this year, Zach LaVine goes down and bam, all of a sudden, Kobe White, 19 points per game, 5 assists, 5 rebounds, roughly the same efficiency as last year, albeit on significantly increased volume. Is a focal point of that team's offense, kind of went from being an off-ball player and like fast twitch athlete, kind of playing off the catch kind of guy alongside their primary pieces to like, he's bringing up the ball, running pick and rolls, creating shots for himself off the dribble. A guy that I'm comfortable like running your offense for significant portions of a game. And then the defense, obviously the Bulls, you know, they're not a great defense, but defense isn't as much of the problem for them as it is their offense most of the time. But I think he's been a plus defender. But yeah, he's kind of where this award, I'm like, yeah, this is the guy I'm looking for, where he's in his 6th season. He's kind of had a crappy hand dealt to him, just with the players he's been surrounded by. Never really seemed like he found a rhythm. And then all of a sudden this year, the stars align for him. And, oh, wow, Kobe White, very good player. Who would have thought? I will say Tyrese Maxey does not fit this award for me. And I know a lot of people are trying to push the Tyrese Maxey thing, and I'm fine with it. If you have Tyrese Maxey as your most improved player, whatever. But a lot of it for him is the usage and the role. Tyrese Maxey was always going to be this player if he got the opportunity to be this player. The problem was he was playing next to James Harden. He was not going to become Tyrese Maxey playing off of James Harden, and he still did perfectly fine playing alongside James Harden. It's like, it's not like he was bad. It's like Tyrese Maxey's been a good player. It's just he got the opportunity now in his 3rd year. It's like I think he probably could have taken this leap his 2nd year if he didn't have to play alongside James Harden. So just to give you all an idea of where I'm at. But I actually like the Miles McBride pick. It was one that I hadn't thought about at all, not even a little bit. And I saw it and I was like, this is going to be fun to hear the pitch on this. And I like it. I like it a lot.
So I just want to take a second and try to not explain to you, that sounds too condescending, but given your own parameters for the award and what you say you look for, I think Jalen Williams not only does fit even as a 2nd-year player, like your parameters, I think he kind of runs away with it. So you said you look for outlier levels of improvement. Jalen Williams last season was already a really good player. He was in the 70th percentile in overall EPM. So for a rookie, that's pretty outlier levels already. He's already just a really good rookie. If you're a really good rookie and you're 20 years old, it's hard to get better the 2nd season. It's just hard. Like it's Karl Anthony Towns had one of the greatest rookie seasons of all time. And like he's improved as a basketball player, but his overall impact has not improved drastically from that rookie season, just because it's so hard to be better than you already are if your rookie season's really good. Jalen Williams has improved at pretty much every single part of basketball and should have been an all-star this season, in my opinion, as a 2nd-year player. He's in the 94th percentile in overall EPM. He's already, at 22 years old, one of the best wing defenders in the entire NBA. He's shooting a ridiculous 49.6% from the mid-range. Me and XJ actually spent an hour together on a call last week going through the numbers. There's nobody in the entire NBA besides DeJounte Murray who shoots better from 10 to 19 feet, from 10 feet to the 3-point line. Nobody in the entire league. But here's the kicker. He is averaging 6.2 attempts from the mid-range, which is per 75 possessions, which is in the 92nd percentile. All of a sudden, this defense first wing who is supposed to come in and maybe he'd develop a shot one day is one of the best mid-range players in the entire league in his second year. Hasn't hurt his defense. He's shooting 43% from three. He is an elite player. There's an argument for him being literally an argument for him being a fringe all-NBA player already. This is not normal. Oh, he was a rookie and he got better as a second-year player. He was already an outlier level rookie impact player. And then he made another outlier level leap in just his second year. I think this is one of the greatest improvements we've seen in like the last 10 years from both a skill level and an impact level. And that's why I feel very strongly that he should win the award.
Yeah, I don't disagree with anything that you said. The reason I don't personally have him really in the conversation at all is just because I think it's more of an issue. Like the improvement looks the way that it does for a couple of different reasons. One, because he was drafted like not even top 10. And so we kind of look at his improvement like, holy cow, he was drafted this low. Like, yeah, he was still a lottery pick, but like, you know, in hindsight, he probably should have gone top 5. I would imagine, I can't think of all the draft picks off the top of my head, but he certainly would go top 5 in a redraft just based on a quick gut check. So to me, it's more of an issue of like, he was overall poorly scouted. So the expectations were different. So like, yeah, we're looking at it now, like no one expected him to be like this. But then you go back and you watch his college tape and you're like, well, the signs were there. The signs were definitely there. Somebody posted a compilation of shots that he's made this year compared to some of the shots he was taking and making in college. And it was like, oh, how could we have not seen this coming? It's like he was doing this in college. So to me, it's kind of like his scouting profile didn't really tell the whole story. So the expectations were a lot different. And then also, I will say, just as a Thunder fan, Jalen Williams, I've been singing Jalen Williams praise for like 2 years now. But last year, I'll be honest, Jalen Williams this year is not doing a whole lot different than he was doing last year. Just like yes, efficiency numbers are up in a lot of areas. But like in terms of the things that he's doing, it's like, yeah, he was doing this last year. He's just getting a lot like, oh, now he gets to start fourth quarters with Shea on the bench and he gets six minutes in the fourth quarter to just like cook. And it's like, yeah, we saw him cooking last year too. It's just he wasn't getting an entire half a quarter to do it. And that's not to say the improvement.
Can I just say two stats that I think might poke a little hole in that. Two stats. One, sure. Per 75 possessions, he's shooting over double the attempts from mid-range, which show, to me at least, not only an increase in roll, but also an improvement in the ability to get to certain spots on the floor if you're doing it more per 75 possessions. And then second, something that correlates with that, last season he was assisted on almost 91% of his three-pointers, which was in the 40th percentile. This season he's being assisted on only 75% of his three-pointers. 15% fewer of his three-pointers are being assisted on. I feel like it's hard to get there if he hasn't made a pretty drastic improvement with his ball handling and his quickness, his ability to get to certain spots on the floor.
So I would actually say that those numbers lend credence to the idea that he could do this last year, had to prove that he could do this, even though we saw last year the flashes, quote unquote, and then now he's getting more opportunity this year. I think it's more of a situation of not necessarily outlier development of sheer improvement and more of just coaching staff figuring out what they have and what he's capable of. And oh, okay, he can do this consistently. Let's lean into it more rather than he couldn't do it in the past and then now he can do it. It's more of just learning what you have with a player and then figuring out how to exploit their strengths to the fullest.
Yeah.
I just one more thing, actually. Sorry. I guess even if what you're saying is true, and I totally believe that what you're saying is true, to go from 35% to 43% from three, to go from 42% to 49% from mid-range, to have your efficiency spike that hard when your usage and your role increases is incredibly rare. It's just not something that happens super frequently. And maybe this was always in the cards for him. Again, not saying that's not true, but he's still, like we talked about Norman Powell, you still have to go out and do it. And he is doing it in spades. And to me, that's remarkably impressive.
Yeah. It's a really good conversation. I think it's such an interesting juxtaposition, not even really juxtaposition, but just like a comparison of the ways that you can look at this award, which is some of the fun of having those discussions. I definitely had Kobe White in my short list as well there. And I think something that's really interesting now is like kind of when I go back and look at this award in future years, something that I'm going to keep track of is like, has their usage kind of maintained? And then we still see a spike in their performance despite having a similar usage. And that's true for Kobe White. I just kind of looked, his usage has been consistent across his career. We just haven't seen this kind of performance on that usage. So that's an interesting thing to think about. A couple other people just I wanted to give a shout out because these are people I thought about. Denny Avdia, who's been so good this year and, has not shown, he's shown signs, and a lot of people have been high on Denny Avdia, but he's been so good relative to the rest of his career. He's in his fourth year. And Isaiah Hartenstein has been a little bit of a journeyman. I wouldn't call him a journeyman necessarily, but he's kind of been trying to find his way in the NBA, got an opportunity to start, and has been an elite defensive player for the Knicks as well. So those are two other players that we kind of had on our short list there. Can
we also say, actually, that I think one of the super interesting things that Alex brought up is how much of it is output versus actual improvement. And like we talked at the beginning of the season about Emmanuel Quickley, and I posed a question to you. I asked you, is it possible that his 2022, 2023, just from a pure impact output standpoint, could that be his most impactful season in terms of impact analytics? And we kind of went back and forth in that. And the truth of the matter is there's all sorts of variance that goes into what your impact is. So like, I guess my point is, it's possible that Jalen Williams gets better as a basketball player, but for certain reasons, whether it's shooting variance, whether it's other things unrelated to his actual improvement as a basketball player, the impact metrics don't capture him as impactful as he was in a season when he was technically a worse basketball player. So you can correct me if I'm wrong, Alex, but I think you're coming at it more from how much did they actually improve at basketball? Like how much how much better did they truly get as basketball players? And what you're saying about Jalen Williams is, okay, when I watch him, I don't see anything monumental outside of the shooting spike. Whereas when I watch Kobe White, this was a guy who couldn't crack the rotation, but through skill improvements, all of a sudden he's almost a different basketball player.
Yeah, to me, like the using the usage kind of difference and increase and fluctuation, generally from like just coaching perspective, I guess, like if a player is getting increased usage, I would hope it is because he can do the things that you're asking him to do. Like to me, increased usage isn't a sign of necessarily just like, okay, we're going to see if you can handle this. Normally, like if you're getting increased usage, it's because there is something that the coaching staff has recognized, like, oh, okay, you can do this, and we're going to increase your like involvement to make sure that we're exploiting this and getting the most out of it. But yeah, definitely like the efficiency stuff with Jalen Williams, I'm with you. It's like especially like the 3-point improvement. It's something that, yeah, we don't necessarily see a ton. So yeah, in that regard, he's improved, but also just in general, like second year players, especially when it comes to efficiency, I'm like, I sure hope they improve. Like that's always the thing that with rookies, you're like, okay, rookie year to sophomore year, if nothing else, we want to see you improve in your efficiency.
For sure. And the guy calling the shots on who's getting that increased usage may come up in this next conversation here. I think we want to kind of fly through this one so we can get to our all NBA teams. We have the coach of the year conversation. And to me, this one is like the hardest. I don't know. And Alex, I'd really love to hear from you how you evaluate coaching. I don't really have a great way to do it. It often feels like a process of elimination conversation where it's like, expectations versus reality, and if reality surpasses expectations, it's like, I don't know, it's probably the coach's fault. So it's a really tough to evaluate coaching. I think I don't have a good way to do it, but given that context, we went with Jamal Mosley as our coach of the year for number one candidate. And then our top three is rounded out by having Coach Dags. We talked about how to pronounce his name, and I'm not going to make an attempt to do it here. Coach Dags from the Oklahoma City Thunder. And also Finch as our third candidate for coach of the year. So Alex, you want to take it away with your choice?
These would be my three guys. My order would be different. Like you said, it's kind of hard for like a outsider to evaluate coaching because there's so much that we don't get to see, and there's only so much that we can pick up on like watching a game. Mark Daigneault would probably be number one for me because the thing that I look at when I'm like evaluating coaching just as best I can from my perspective is like, how are you able to maximize your roster to like balance things out between offense and defense to where you're not giving up a ton on either one? Like the flaw with the Magic is like, yes, their defense is fantastic and they've improved a ton from last year, but that offense is still highly, highly, highly questionable. For the Thunder, what really sells me with Daigneault is they've been top 10 offense and defense all year. I'm pretty sure they're top 5 half-court offense and half-court defense this year, which like is insane. That's like, if you go back through the last like 15 years, that's one of the telltale signs of like a true contender is like, oh, were they top 10 half-court defense and offense? Yes. Oh, chances are they might have gone to the finals or they made a deep playoff run. Like that is always something that is a sign of being a contender. And with Daigneault, he's kind of taken this team where, trust me, I'll be the first to tell you, I am a lot harsher on the Thunder than like probably 90% of Thunder fans. The Thunder are not without their flaws and they are not without their flawed players. And despite that, I think Daigneault has done a really, really good job of, okay, these are the players we have. Let's work with it and maximize our approach and like not try to put Band-Aids over bullet wounds and instead like, okay, how can we turn this problem into leaning into another strength instead of focusing so much on like what we're not good at?
I said this to you before we hopped on the air. Daigneault's quote about being malleable and about every decision, every transaction having trade-offs is probably my favorite soundbite of the season because it's just it encapsulates everything I believe about not just the NBA, but in life. Utopia doesn't exist, perfect world doesn't exist. Every decision we make has trade-offs, and you have to factor in both sides. You can't just look at as an NBA head coach, you can't look at a thing and say I need this and ignore the potential downsides. Or on the other hand, you can't just be like, oh, I can't do this because of the potential downsides. You have to look at the whole picture all the time. And to me, that showed me that Daigneault is always looking at the entire picture. And that leads me to wanting to ask a question back to you. And I think it's something that piques the interest of both me and XJ, because it's the one kind of confusing thing about the Thunder. What's the deal with Josh Giddey? Like, and I don't even mean as a basketball player, but he doesn't really seem to fit like their vision, their flexibility. You look at the lineup data, they're way better if you replace Giddey with Isaiah Joe. And look, we talked about diminishing skill sets earlier on this pod. I don't think you can find two more diminishing skill sets than SGA and Josh Giddey. Josh Giddey doesn't do anything to elevate SGA when he's on the court, and vice versa. But the problem is SGA is way better, so SGA's diminishing effects don't actually matter. You're going to run the offense through SGA. Why not just make Giddey a super six man and try to stagger their minutes more? Well, is there anything going on that we're missing? Because I don't want to speak for you, but I think the Thunder get better if they turn Giddey into a six man.
No, concur. Proceed, Alex.
a lot of this is speculative, but I think probably some of it is front office politics. And like in a perfect world, he can shoot off the catch. And I'm not saying this is like close to reality or something that like we're approaching anytime soon. But like in a perfect world, he can shoot off the catch, attack off the catch, and then you also get the playmaking that he can do, the passing off the catch, whenever that advantage is created or developed. We're still probably a ways off from that. And I think come playoff time, if you encounter a situation of like, he's kind of getting played off the floor, then I think probably the Thunder will have that conversation of like, yeah, you went from playing 20 minutes a game in this playoff series to now you're maybe getting 5. We'll see.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, that's a good answer. And also I don't want, if you're a Thunder fan listening to this, XJ and I also realize that Giddey's a good player in his own right. Like 85th percentile offensive EPM. This is a good basketball player. It's less about who he is as a basketball player and more about you have SGA, you have Jalen Williams, you have Chet Holmgren. These 3 pieces are, Celtics aside, maybe 3 of the best high-level pieces in the entire NBA. And then Giddey just kind of seems like a weird fit to go along with those 3 guys. Whereas you have Isaiah Joe, you have Aaron Wiggins has been playing more recently, been playing well. I think Kenrich Williams always rates well in impact stats. So you have a couple guys who are maybe more super role players who can be replaced one another over and over and fit in really nicely with Williams, SGA, and Chet. And yeah, the Giddey thing is just always sort of confused me.
It confuses me too. Don't worry. You all aren't alone.
Yeah, I love getting this insight here, and I think Dags is obviously a tremendous pick. I think it's probably a toss up between he and Mosley, but if I had to pick a coach, to move forward with for the next 5 years, it'd be Dagnall. So I think that's the OKC. Listen, okay, I'll just say this before we switch gears to just close out with our All NBA teams. I contribute, to the Knicks Film School podcast, and in our faculty chat thread, I did say maybe a few months ago, I said, listen, this is what it's going to be. OKC is going to be a dynasty. Dags is a generational coach. Presti is a Hall of Famer. Like I'm all aboard. So I think so I'm really excited to see how they move forward. Let us close it out with our all NBA teams. We only have kind of a few minutes left. We want to get out of here. So let's kind of go through all 3 teams. It'll be a little bit unwieldy, but I think the audience will be able to follow. For the hot hand theory side, our all NBA first team should come as no surprise, the 3 guys that we have as MVP candidates: Luka Doncic, SGA, Nikola Jokic, and then we round it out with Kawhi and Giannis. That is our first team. Second team, we have Jalen Brunson, LeBron James, Jason Tatum, Paul George, and Devin Booker. And then for our third team, Tyrese Halliburton, Steph Curry, Kevin Durant, AD, and Wembanyama. Alex, do you want to just give your team, just your 3 teams real quick, and then we can just figure out what kind of parts of it we want to discuss or where our disagreements are?
So my All-NBA first team is the same. The only difference is instead of Kawhi, I have Tatum. And then my second team, let me just double check. Brunson, LeBron, Kawhi, Paul George. Did Kevin Durant meet the game requirement? He did. Right? He's on our third team. We flipped sons. We have Booker on second team, and so I would have Durant on second team instead of Paul George. I would have Paul George third team. And then my third team, you have Halliburton, Steph. And then for me, it would be Paul George, AD, and Wemby. I haven't thought about third team, but I'm pretty comfortable with that third team. And it is funny. I want to point out Wemby making all NBA third team as a rookie, not just like is something that I'm good with. Like I agree with that, but like might actually happen. And then we also have the whole defensive player of the year discussion that we had earlier. It's like, he might make all NBA third team. Gobert's not making all NBA third team, but Gobert's probably going to win defensive player of the year. Wemby's going to get the all NBA team. It's funny to think about that.
Yeah. I think just to close it out, I don't think, I'm sure Knicks fans will get to the end of this and be furious we didn't have Brunson on the first team just because that's how fan bases work. But Kawhi, to me, Kawhi versus Brunson is pretty close. I think you can go either way. whatever. I mean, it's just not. I think the most interesting part of this that I'm very curious to hear your perspective on is nobody mentioned Sabonis, and neither XJ or I have been super high on Sabonis all year. The impact metrics definitely don't love Sabonis relative to his reputation this season. What are your thoughts on Sabonis? Because he's been inside the top 10 of this MVP ladder all season since they've been releasing it. And do you think it's reasonable to not have him on any of these teams, or do you think that he should garner more consideration?
I'm somebody who I love Sabonis. I love his game. For some reason, like kind of the narrative lately with him has become he's like not fun to watch. And I don't get that personally, because I love really cool post footwork. I love passing bigs. I love like strong DHO initiators. And people are like, oh, everyone can do that. I'm like, okay, well, if everyone can do that, then why isn't every team doing it? Like, that just doesn't make sense. You have to be a good screen setter. You have to be able to be an illegal screen setter and get away with it, which is an underrated. I hate that it's become a skill, but it is a skill in today's NBA. Like, the difference between a Sabonis and an Onyeka Okongwu is Sabonis is able to get away with those without getting called for it. And, you know, whatever the reason behind that is, I think there is, like, you have to be able to hide it a little bit. I think Sabonis is very fun to watch. I think he's a very, very good player. But I think the thing that really sticks out, if you look at the all NBA teams, like these guys, you put them on any team and they're going to be successful. They're going to be good. They're all, some people hate this word, they're all portable. They're portable players, or they're just so freaking good that it doesn't matter how portable they are. Like Giannis would be the first one that someone would probably cite and be like, well, he's not portable because he can't shoot. He can't play off ball, this and that. And it's like, okay, but it's Giannis. Sabonis, for as good as he is, he's not a Giannis. And like, you have to either be just so freaking good that it doesn't matter, or you have to have that level of portability that makes you like really pop impact wise. And Sabonis, like, the argument against him would just be, yes, he's spectacular. He's incredibly talented. He can do so much. And if you put the right team around him and run the right offense around him, he's going to be fantastic. But impact wise, like, he's not a great defender. He's been better defensively this year. I'll stick up for him there, but he's still not a great defender. And he still has a fair share of deficiencies. Like, people cite the 3-point improvement, and I'm like, guys, he's attempting what, like 2 threes a game, 1 3 a game? It's like 43% on 1.5 attempts a game isn't really moving the needle for me. It's like, are you attempting on a large enough volume that the defense actually has the game plan for it? That's where I'm starting to be like, oh, okay, well, that could really separate him and put him into the all NBA discussion. It's like, he's still Sabonis. Not a whole lot has changed. And unfortunately, like, look at all the competition in the NBA right now in terms of just good players. It's like Sabonis just suffers from, yeah, you're an incredible player, but there's just a lot of guys who are better.
It's funny that you brought up the 3-point shooting specifically. He's averaging the same amount of 3-point attempts per 75 possessions as he did last year. And relative to the rest of the league, that's actually gone down. He's in the 8th percentile instead of the 11th percentile. And he averaged double the attempts 2 years ago when he played in Indiana half the year and then he got traded. So I think 3-point shooting is pretty much out the window for Sabonis since he went to Sacramento. So that's an interesting place to lean on for Sabonis improvement. Right. I think that if you were going to make a single argument for Sabonis, it would just be the volume. He hasn't missed a game this season. There, what is LeBron always says, the most valuable thing is availability, or whatever.
The most important ability is availability.
Yeah, the most important ability is availability. There you go. That's what he says. A lot of value in that. You look at BPM, he's 6th overall in BPM, and unlike Jokic not being super carried by his defense, 22nd in expected wins. XJ, do you have any additional thoughts on Sabonis? Should we have given him more consideration? Should we have given him less consideration? Anything else we missed?
No, I think it's right. And I largely agree with what Alex said. I think he just suffers from the fact that you have to run a particular style of offense when you have Domantas Sabonis. And because of that, And that's fine because he's really good. But in order to make this list, he has to be a little bit better to justify that. And I think that's the issue. If you could just throw Sabonis out there and it's like, yeah, we'll run a different type of offense, but he's going to space out and hit threes at a high clip on on decent volume, not the kind of awful like bottom tier volume that we've seen from him this year, then it'd be a different conversation. But I just don't think he's good enough to warrant the fact that you have to play in a particular way when you have Domantas Sabonis. But still an excellent player, a guy I love watching. I love the DHO action. The Knicks do a facsimile of that with Isaiah Hartenstein at some cases as well. So I love that style of offense. But we're gonna close it out there. It's a really good conversation. Most of our all NBA teams are pretty much aligned, so not too much disagreement there. Really love the conversations that we had with you, Alex. Appreciate you giving us so much time and hanging in there with us and hanging out with us. Any last things that you want to say? Again, Alex Hoops on YouTube. You all should know that if you're watching this. And the Media Pass is an excellent, underrated podcast at this point. Anything you want to say before you head on out, Alex?
Thanks for having me. I had a great time. Always love having discussions like this. Anytime you can debate and talk about basketball in like a productive manner, I'm all about it. I love it. So appreciate you guys having me on.
Awesome. Yeah, really appreciate you. And this has been Hot Hand Theory.